Hello.
Hello.
Dunleary. Hello, Dunleary. This is a thrilling one for me personally. So Niall and myself, over the last couple of years, we've gone around the country just interviewing musicians we admired, people whose records we bought, whose tapes we taped, and you know, bands that we went to see. We've interviewed over 160 people now, and it's just to leave a legacy, an oral history of how things worked. DIY, people signed to major labels, and we thought, let's do one in Dunleary, because we generally did them in pubs, and we thought, why are we trying to get people to go to pubs in Dublin when they're nice local places? So Neil has been incredibly gracious and has become a friend at this stage, because we're always annoying him. So thanks very much to Neil. Going by, yeah, but instead of clapping, maybe go up and buy a couple of ELO box sets or something. make it worth his while. But I don't know what any of you were doing 37 years ago today, but 37 years ago today, I went to see my friend Niall play a gig with his band, Not Our World, and Celtic Conviction. There was a lad from South Park in them, and the Lawnmowers, which was Seamus Heaney's son. Seamus probably had the better lyrics, but you know, the band were great. So most of my life has been spent going to gigs, and I was remembering one particular gig this afternoon, and it was when Niall brought a band over from LA called the Vandals. And Niall liked to show bands a really good time, you know, and show them what Ireland could offer. So we met them down at the car ferry, and we said, we'll get the bus into town. And, you know, this band from LA were thinking, a tour bus. And then the 46A pulled out the terrace, and we said, here's the bus. And, you know, we'll help you with your stuff. And I don't remember, I paid their fare. I thought, like, I'll invest in rock. So they played 2 gigs for Niall. The second one was in Sides. Was the first one in the Fox and Pheasant?
The Earl Grattan.
The Earl Grattan. And I got chatting to the drummer, really nice bloke, lovely guy. He just joined the band, and he was nice. And you know, they wanted to go to a bar in Dublin where there'd be a fight, and said, you know, we'd love, you know, if there's a punch up, and then, you know, what kind of bars where, you know, people punch each other and then they say, hey, you're all right, let's have a pint. I said, there's none of those in Dunleary. Like they wouldn't stop. So, you know, we'll go into town. But anyway, I was doing a bit of research for this today, and I thought, I wonder what happened to members of the Vandals. You know, and Niall brought them to Dublin and, you know, put them on in the only gay club in the city centre, and in a dodgy bar where you'd go and see ballads, the Earl Grattan. And I looked him up, and the next time he came to Ireland, he was in Guns N' Roses. And, you know, because on the bus, sometimes I think better on the bus, and I was thinking, I wonder if Josh from the Vandals ever like said to Axl Rose, I know what we can do to break Ireland. I know a guy who can get us a gig in the gay bar and in a trad place. We can do 2 gigs. And Axl Rose probably looked at him and thought, no, we'd probably go with MCD and do Slane instead. But going to gigs, my life, and there's 2 people who I really, really admire, and 2 people who really made a big impression on me in my gig going. And Trevor lived on the same road as me. Now, Clonkeene Drive wasn't South Central, and you know, it wasn't Paris, but there were a load of people there who loved music. And up past where you lived, there was a family called the Cremens. Opposite them, there were the Johnsons, and they were mad Virgin Prunes fans. So Clonkeene Drive probably had the biggest percentage of Virgin Prunes fans in per capita. But, you know, I remember I'd see you with your case, you know, with this keyboard case, and I was like, God, that lad, he must be serious about his music. And there was a time I remembered very well in the early 80s when I started going to gigs where Out of the Fae were as big as you could get as an Irish band. And we used to go out to Bray to see you, sometimes in the Mississippi Rooms, sometimes in Rock Hall. And I was doing a talk for Culture Night, and a lad came up and said, "Oh, you mentioned Out of the Fae, that's so great." Me and my mates lived in Portmarnock, and we used to go and see Out of the Fae in Bray, and we'd sleep on the beach because there was no way home. You'd missed the last bus. And they said, "We've never ever met a band who were so nice to us," because we were young fellas, they were a bit older, but they were always worried, were we safe? Did we, were we okay? So I love that 40 years later, he still remembered not just how great your music was, but how decent you were as people, and how nice you were to ordinary people like us. I could talk about the many times I saw you, but I've spoken too much already. So, like, Trevor, like, how did you get into music? What were you listening to growing up, and were you trained as a musician?
Like a dog. I was born in England, in York, just outside of York, and my dad was in the RAF. So, but they're both from just up the road here in Dunleary, like Rosmean Gardens, Sandy Cove, my mother and father. So, so the first couple of years were there. Then we came back to Dunleary. But then, for most of my early life, up till I was 16, was in Belfast, actually, just off the Ormeau Road is where I grew up. And I suppose the things that were musically around me at the time, my dad was in the brass band, and both my mother and father were fairly religious and wanting to do the prod thing. So there was Bible class, Sunday school, and all this type of thing. So there's a lot of church music, brass band, marching music, military stuff, which you can, actually, as I was getting into teenage times, I wanted to sort of chuck it into whatever the nearest river, Laoghaire or whatever. But later on, it became, I could appreciate that all those sounds I was hearing. Like, I still love the sound of a brass band. It's still, it's a very emotional kind of sound when you hear it, especially playing old Victorian hymns. It's very moving. So, and then I was sent to piano lessons. I had a wonderfully named teacher called Harriet Officer, who was a lovely woman. She lived with either her one or two sisters, I'm not sure. So I'd go every week. She was not a kind of a whack on the knuckles teacher. She'd have to kind of scribble notes to say how good or bad, but she never ever wrote anything bad about me, which is amazing, because sometimes I wouldn't practice at all. But that was scales and all that type of stuff. And I mean, I was playing Mozart. I got up to grade 7 eventually, so I didn't get to grade 8 or complete the diploma. And then in the 68, 69, I had the radio Luxembourg under the pillow, or Caroline, whatever, and was beginning to, things like the Small Faces and the Beatles and Jimi Hendrix were filtering into my ear, into my brain. So I can remember bringing along sheet music. She didn't operate without sheet music. So I can remember bringing along, for instance, Lazy Sunday, Small Faces, the sheet music, wouldn't it be nice? And she taught, she actually went through it. Here, this is this, and a lot of the times the sheet music was pretty good, and what's the word? The chords that they gave you were quite accurate to what was actually on the record. So there was all these amazing, like, now this was very different from Mozart and stuff, but in a certain way, you know, you'd say not that sort of vaudeville thing that the Beatles kind of went down into. So it wasn't so, even though it had a trippy acid thing going on, but in a certain way it wasn't that different from you know, brass band, Victorian stuff. I had my uncle Billy, he played the clarinet in the Jazz Coasters. They had residency in the Merrion Inn for years and years. So that was another bit that was going in. Oscar Peterson, he was Errol Garner, all those Dixieland and more straight ahead kind of jazz, you know, which was very popular here at the time. You know, people like Rock Fox and all that. So, and you know, I'd go along and eventually go along and see them, appreciate it a bit more. So all of that was kind of swimming around. And then I remember going to see Jethro Tull. I don't know how I managed to get a ticket because I was only 16, you know. Stand Up was the album they had, and they played in the Ulster Hall. And that I went, I got a ticket like off on my own to go, and I still can't really figure out how did that happen. Where did they get the money? Why? How? Well, so, but that I know that made a big impression on me. And then with all the troubles were brewing, you know, so that I had to living through going to school, being stopped at turnstiles with get your bag searched on the bus going home, soldiers, you know. So, and my dad was getting quite a bit of hassle. He didn't really say anything. He lost his job, and then. And also he's a bit outspoken in the brass band. Was Protestant, very Protestant thing. So they started bringing in this particular band, bringing Catholics into the band, and then girls, even worse possibly. But so we got into a lot of trouble for they weren't sticking to the Orange Order old style kind of thing. And anyway, him losing his job, so he got an offer to go back to Dunleary, and that's how I kind of ended up only up the road here.
And what age were you when you moved from Belfast?
16.
Okay, so you're young, and was there a piano in your home?
Oh yeah. No,
okay.
yeah. That's what the scales were on. Yeah.
So you were able to practice at home. You had this interest. You're pulling on the hymns and, you know, the melodies of those. You know, the Beatles were listening to that stuff. The Faces, Jethro Tull were coming from that. So you're absorbing all this music, and then you're finding this youth culture as well with Jethro Tull, and then you come to Clonkeen Drive.
Yep. So I had a couple of years in school down here. Then I made an attempt at going to Bolton Street to be a geo surveyor. Didn't work out. And that's then sort of the music gradually overcame that, and that's when I started meeting different people, you know, other musicians, like-minded people, lots of sitting in smoky rooms, smoking all sorts of stuff, and so from that time then I started, you know, I was going to gigs. I was just trying to remember some of the gigs. I went to see things like Focus, Hawkwind in the stadium. Was a great place to see bands. There's a bit of the dates are not very good now, a bit cluttered. But and I was playing a bit with Jimmy Slevin. I was playing with another fella, Jack Nairn, actually, who lived down the road in Dean's Grange. He played acoustic guitar, so he was writing his own songs, and that became, you know, you can kind of do this as well. So I kind of wrote a couple of things with him. We as a trio, another guy, Alan Doyle, guitar player, and we did a support to Horslips down in Wexford with me on an acoustic piano and a Wham copycat with the mic going into it, and the two acoustic guitar, and they were not that helpful. So God knows what it sounded like. But that was sort of the beginnings of that sort of thing, and then just gradually meeting other people, you know. People like Garvin Gallagher, who I'm still playing with, you know, 56 years later, you know.
So you kind of found your tribe. You found like-minded people who weren't just listening to music, but you know, were able to express themselves and to write songs. Yeah. And you know, where did it evolve from there, Trevor? Like, where did, you know, was there a time where you thought, I want this to be my life, I want to take this seriously, or did it just evolve?
It just evolved, and it was kind of easier than getting up early to go to work. And there was a lot of fun, you know, hanging out, playing in bars late at night. Lots of drug taking of all caliber, and then it seemed to be just sort of a natural thing. Oh, we could be in a band, and we could play some stuff together. This is Garvin, a band called Naima, which was actually, that's one of the first sort of things that sort of got a bit serious, jazz rock. When I think of it now, we're doing covers of Chick Corea and John McLaughlin.
That's a good
Talk about nerve, you know.
Yeah.
But playing in the Marion Inn.
Right.
And we got gigs in Trinity and UCD. We were on RTE a couple of times. You know, performed doing live stuff. But that was kind of when I said, kind of accidentally said, I can make something out of this, and all of the scales started to prove a little bit useful. And I just remember now, like an important gig I went to back then was Lindisfarne were actually top of the bill in the stadium, and the support band were Genesis. And it was the first time that Peter Gabriel ever wore the fox's head and the red dress, if you kind of remember. And I remember at that's probably a turning point, a big one, you know, to say, oh my God. And the classically trained keyboard, and also the theatrical element, which I was just, even though I no theatre background at all, you know, but that I was sort of taken by this, you know. There's a fox with playing the flute and a bass drum at the front of the band. I said, this sounds like something I could get into.
So you're going to see the bands, you're getting inspired by contemporary music, but you've got this background of, you know, being a serious, you know, kind of scholar of playing the piano. And
I don't go that far now.
Well, no, you could play. You could absolutely play. And there was that kind of jazz, but progressive jazz scene in Dublin with Supply, Demand and Curve and other bands. And then Horseflips had proven that you can be a young band and you can make Ireland, you know, into a place where you can play a lot to large crowds. Mm-hmm. And then you open for them, and then where you see the Fox in the National Stadium. Mm-hmm. And theatre, because to me, Out of the Fay, one of the things about them, we never knew what we were going to see, because there was always something going on visually. So that to me is an intriguing part of your story and what you brought to Irish rock. So you're doing the jazz thing, you're having fun, you're going to gigs, and then where's your next move?
So Naima kind of fizzled out, and then there was another band with probably the worst name in Irish rock or any history called No Bucket. We were waiting for that.
Yeah, that's up there with Mangled Ferret. That is no point.
I think Mangled Ferret would be better. Anyway, so and we were playing. It was the same sort of thing, jazz rock, a bit more towards soft machine, that end of things, and always writing my own stuff in the midst of this. And then the guitar player, the bass player, not sure which, got an offer to go to Holland. There was some gigs there that we could do in university kind of places and little clubs. So literally just put the stuff. I took the long route via London to Harwich to the Hook of Holland with a 4x12 H&H, a Fender Rhodes synthesizer. I said, no wonder my back is fucked now, But and the other guys had gone over first, and then I went over. Then we had quite a few gigs playing all over Holland, and then we had a place to stay, going to see things over there. Saw Peter Gabriel again there, actually, his first solo tour. Sort of after the flood, around that sort of era, and but then we, so that band didn't. It might have lasted for a year, and then suddenly you couldn't get any work there. I hadn't really met any out Dutch people to start playing with, talking to. But so then I ended up working in the factories there for a while, just to have a few quid, and then the drummer who owned a bar that we kind of knew, he suddenly said, our keyboard player's gone back to America. So I got a gig with these guys, and that sort of became the first Auto da Fe. And I'd met Gay briefly in Ireland and done a demo with Terry and Gay Woods prior to this, so we looked at each other across the table, and her marriage wasn't going great at that particular time, but it took a long time before then suddenly she said, I'm actually coming to Holland. This is by letter and by phone and stuff, back in the old days. So, oh geez, right. So anyway, so she came over and very quickly became the singer in the band. And then we got quite a few gigs. We came back and did a couple of tours. This is kind of scooting through history quick. There was kind of very tiny guarantees. I don't know how we did it at all. I mean, I remember that we were playing in Lahinch, and we stayed in tents. Right, we didn't realise we were very close to the Cliffs of Moher, but it was like the back of the van or a tent, so there wasn't even enough money for a B&B, so it was very crude. And then we did that tour. Then we went back to Holland. Then we came back again. This time we actually didn't bring a band with us, but that's when I met Robbie Brennan. And I actually met him in the supermarket just up the road here in the shopping centre. And just, what are you doing? And he was, I think, just ending his time there. And he knew Mark from the Radiators. And he said, there's a bass player and I don't think he's doing anything. Why not? And so it sort of very accidentally fell. And then we had a few songs. We were still kind of in between, where we punks, where we new wave, where we this, where we that. We didn't know what we were, so it was a little, which made it without, when you're not getting going, it's like you need a one identity for a record company. When you're flipping between different styles, they just find it impossible. Well, back then anyway. I'm sure it's probably the same now.
Oh, absolutely. And you kind of were pushing the genres. So just rewind a second. So with Gay and Terry Woods, were you playing piano or keyboards on that recording?
Yeah.
Okay. And you know, for any of the scholars out there, Gay and Terry Woods were some of the most important musicians that Ireland ever produced. And at their time, they were outstanding and really important. Terry then went on to be in the Pogues. They were a folk band that really pushed the envelope. So, punk. Did punk make it? Did you like any of the punk songs?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, absolutely. And funnily, when I was in Holland, it was the things like Crass and Poison Girls, and that end of punk. You know, Crass, the famous cry, "The name is Crass, not Clash." You know, so it was kind of much more political and not very interested in the charts, let's say, or how you looked. I mean, they had long hair people, and Crass, for instance, in the band. So but they were very just a political, much more of a political band. But Poison Girls, for some reason, used to tour in Holland quite a bit. Along with it, they would arrive with about 40 TV sets with miners' strike and all of that kind of thing was going on. Very anti-monarchy and all that sort of. So that again was all very theatrical. So myself loved that. Then Susie and the Banshees, Echo and the Bunnymen. There was quite a few things wherein we went. We would have seen over in Holland, and then when we came back again, these were all in their very early days, so be the end of the 70s. I think the Sex Pistols actually played in Arnhem, and I remember going to it, but I think the gig was called off, and there was just a big mash of people outside the place, and nothing happened. Oh no, they were on our radar, absolutely, and I loved the energy of it. There's always that thing of around that time of where it was almost like would you have to really pretend that you couldn't play so well? The barriers were erected, and you had to fit in. But I also thought you would have been a sensational punk band. More like the Poison Girls. That anarcho end of things. And I saw a poster on the internet where you played with John Cooper Clarke in the Paradiso in Amsterdam. He's a wonderful man, terrific. We did this tour of 4 or 5 gigs, and he in Holland, and he was top of the bill. He was much more well known than we were, but he's very generous. He just said, we swapped it around. He said, look, this is ridiculous, a poet going on last. He said, you should be going on last. He said, then they want to dance after they've heard me, So we got on very well with him, terrific man. How
decent then, so you do those shoestring budget gigs, where you have to sleep in the tent or the van, there's no money, but then your profile, with November, with the singles coming out, you became quite a well-known band. Like, did you have a manager, or were you doing all that yourselves, or?
Pretty much ourselves, yeah. We had a guy, Kevin Dunn, actually, I don't know that name. He was a photographer, so he did all our shots at the time, so we got good photographs, but he was kind of like a manager without a phone.
Yeah.
So you had to ring, and it was a coin box down the road or something, I don't know. Probably the manager wasn't so important as meeting Phil Lynott.
Yeah. So
and he probably, if you just back a bit before November.
Yeah. So how did you meet Phil Lynott?
We were doing a demo in Windmill. Actually Kevin, the manager, he said, I'll pay for it, we'll go in. And we just went in, and Philip was in another room, or he was doing something else, and he knew Robbie, because they both played in Skid Row together. And what are you doing, man? Blah, 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 blah. And come in and have a let's go. Oh, Jesus, gay. How are you? Because they lived in the same place over in London. There was a couple of houses that people, musicians, Gary Moore and Brush, Strangely Strange, they were all kind of in a bit of a mush at the time, and so Philip knew, he knew the two of them, and then that sounds good, and then so he actually tried to produce what we'd started as an attempt at a couple of singles, but the demos they sort of stayed demos, and he couldn't do anything more with them. Then we got a gig to do. We had to do a backing track or two for RTE when they paid for you to do a backing track. So we got a few hours in Westland or Lombard actually, as it was, and so. We went in there to do these backing tracks, and Philip just came in and then said, "Have you anything else?" So we have these songs we're playing live November. Okay, give it a go. And so we put it down in about 3 hours. So kind of RTE in a strange way paid for it, and then mixed it, and then he got his plugger. But they had pluggers. I don't know if they still have them. So. This guy called Harry Barter was in England, and he had this guy I know, Harry Barter. He'll definitely get this record played, So it's just a kind of that's how that little avenue opened up for us.
Fantastic.
And then he sort of became our manager, this Harry Barter fella, for a while. Yeah.
And you got played on the BBC. You got great airplay on RTE when. RTE2 came in, that the Pirates would have supported you. Hot Press were good to you? Ish. Okay.
No.
Great. Okay.
They could have been a lot better.
Okay. and that's good to know, because, we were just reading it, and that's important, actually, and really good to get on the record. And then you started getting gigs like 1982, I remember you at the Trinity Ball, pretty much headlining, you were that well known. Did you have a booking agent, or was...
MCD.
Okay.
Before it was MCD, I think. Well, no, actually it was MCD, but Dennis was doing it himself. Yeah. This is before he went on to...
own the world.
Large things.
But, so Dennis Desmond, formed a partnership with the other Eamon McCann from the north, and is now one of the most important players in the industry. But he found bands as he was building his business. He was bringing bands over from England, but he was also looking after bands like looking out for bands like you and Blue in Heaven and Mary Coughlin. I know he got involved with that as a manager. But he helped you find some gigs.
Oh no, he was good. Dennis was really great back in those days. You go down and sometimes, you say there's a guarantee, and they'd look, what guarantee? He said, this guarantee that you signed your name on, that's not my signature, But he often waived the cut, as the agent. Yeah. I just said, well, we won't go back there again, But I mean, we're in a mixture of playing in. There was a lot of hotel gigs with discos and chicken and chips, as well as. There wasn't so many regular gigs. Sir Henry's, of course, and the Warwick and Galway, places like that. But there was the touring thing probably was more. There was more hotels. Maybe Waterford, the Showboat. We had down the East Coast was our biggest fan club, and actually a lot of punks used to come to see us in those days. So along with when a bar, because it was open late, had a outfit with a pipe with a guy with a mohican sitting beside him. So.
They're probably both still there. And it looked like you could be the band. It looked like you could be an export, that you could find an audience, but it never quite took off for you.
No.
Did you play enough in England, or
we probably didn't. That was probably just the lack of manager. That fella, he didn't last too much longer. I mean, we put out 5-6 singles, which all got pretty good airplay in England and Ireland, but we were getting good crowds and all here. We did universities in England. We never went to America, and we actually never went back to Holland. But strangely enough, that just didn't work out. And then my daughter, our daughter Lillian, was born in 1986. So that I won't say upset the plans a bit, but it changed the course of it. So suddenly I was doing more sessions and stuff like that, but from the early success we were out. We supported Philip on his solo tour. Robbie and me were in his band as well. So there was a lot of exposure, and RTE were making videos about us and all the rest of it. But it's just that a few bits of luck. People say, always say, why did they never? But there is a lot of luck, and maybe a sort of another killer business streak that we possibly hadn't got either. To say where you need to be more ruthless maybe than we were.
Yeah, as you said, there's so much luck involved, but you left one hell of a legacy. Now, particularly in singles, those early 80s singles are a real testament to, that really, really strange moment where punk was important, the new romantics were important, synth pop was really important, and metal was having a resurgence. Obviously, Phil was beyond an icon. He was someone really, deeply, he meant so much to Ireland, and you were in between. Like, you appealed to all of those people without belonging to one of those tribes. And then you went on to have, I remember going to the Project Art Centre to see a play and thinking, God, the soundtrack, this is fantastic. Like, the music was great, and there in the programme, you had done it. So you continued on, and maybe we'll do another chat to get kind of your adventures after all of the Fae. But this has been brilliant, to get a bit of your story. But also, if there's awards for the chats, you're getting an award for the best impersonation of Phil Lynott and Crass. Which is not expected. You did both of them perfectly. So thanks a million. Give it up for Trevor Knight. So we'll take a 5-minute break if you want to go up and kill a few elves. Fantastic. Welcome to part 2. No pressure, Pat, but that's going to be hard to follow. And I was going to say, the last time I saw you, you were playing in Nando's, but that wasn't the last time I saw you. When the Elfin Hotel.
The Elfin Hotel.
Yeah.
I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah.
There's actually 2 people here who were there at those gigs.
Yeah,
Yes.
they were great, and to me, as someone who was young, who loved music, like, being able to see you in the Elfin Hotel and walk home was a really big deal. That you could see a band that were going to get a record deal, that were making music that you wanted to hear. So Pat O'Donnell from the Fountainhead, and then this amazing post-band career of mentoring and engineering and producing bands. So You know, I interviewed Kieran Owens, who managed the Prunes as well as the Fountainhead, and I spoke to your bandmate, Steve at
Steve
length.
Pelton.
Yeah, so I've a good interview with both of them, and we've had a chat before, but you were there when music completely changed and when the audience for music completely changed. So, you know, I'd love to capture that. So, again, like Trevor, did you grow up with music? You know, were you listening to music as a young person?
Oh yeah, absolutely. But yes, the change. There were a lot of changes in the 70s, I think. You know, for me, I suppose I should start. My history was, I grew up in America, Irish parents. They met in London in the 60s. Sorry, 50s, late 50s. And I was born in late 60 and spent the next 10 years growing up in America. So my earliest memories of the radio were, I remember a little bit of The Summer of Love from my early childhood. But then coming back to, then they moved to London they were there for a few years before finally returning back to Dunleary, which was the big move back home. And I remember our uncle's family came back to, all the O'Donnells came back to Dunleary around 71, 72. So then I remember the next phase, to get up to your question, was, I remember it was the Top of the Pops era. The next thing was growing up glam rock and being a kid watching Top of the Pops with my parents, and you know, and I remember Waterloo and what was that? Bohemian Rhapsody, being at #1 for like 12 weeks or something, you know. So there was all that. But then like other kids, I got a Spanish guitar for Christmas one year, and then I had an older brother who was, my mum had some previous marriages, and I had an older brother whose father died, and he came to live with us, and he brought me over. He was a bit older, and he'd listened to the Stones and all that, and he brought me over a guitar. So I got my first guitar. So I was 12 or 13, learning, you know, American Pie and the likes, you know, and where the House of the Rising Sun, I think, was a big one for all us. So that got us up to, and then we're up to school, finishing school. Then through the 70s, getting into the more serious stuff, you know, Dark Side of the Moon and Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix, and getting into grown-up music and moving beyond Top of the Pops, and then the big change is the one you mentioned, was towards the end of the 70s, was when punk happened, which led to new wave. And initially, I think for people over here, we were a bit behind London. It took us a while to get our heads around it, and I think it interested me. And around this time, I met Steve, my partner from the Fountainhead, you know, around sort of late 70s, early 80s in Dunleary. He was a musician too, and very like Trevor, would have played in some local bands, but I think then what happened was the first thing, I think the thing that really got the Fountainhead started, and again there was that, just the post-punk, when things really started opening up, and there was, you know, electronics were coming. I think technology probably shaped the next phase, you know. So we're heading into the 80s. So we had the new attitude from punk, you know, that you know, finally people were throwing out their Dark Side of the Moons and buying Clash records, and or you know. But I think it really interested us when it got a little bit more, it grew from that, and we heard bands like The Cure and XTC, and then, you know, the first electronic album I remember was probably The Human League and Depeche Mode. There was that. So that was the exciting stuff for us. I think it was around that stage it grabbed us. So how it affected us was, myself and Steve were now friends living in a house in Dunleary. We had a mutual friend, a guy called Conor Murray, who was a big part in our getting started. He had the most amazing record collection. I remember he had all this experimental, he had all the krautrock. He got us into Can, I remember, and bands like that. Funny enough, to me, hearing them, they were like a new band to me around then, even though they were an experimental 70s band. So around that time, it was all these influences coming in, but I think what set us going was, I think we were at the very early stage of DIY recording, and where big studios were super expensive and unobtainable for, I think we got our first 4-track in like 1980 and brought that home. And that's kind of in a way what started the band.
Okay, and that's really important. So where did you get the 4-track?
So Steve had a part-time job fixing, he was good at electronics and that little DIY thing. I remember he was working somewhere, someone traded in this big 4-track reel-to-reel. I think someone bought it and didn't know how to use it or something. So Steve came home with a 4-track one day. Actually, Connor was part of that too. And then I went to London, I remember, with an old suitcase, brought home our first synth, plugged that in. Then we got an electronics magazine, and Steve being good at electronics, we built our first drum machine. So we were off. We had a drum machine, a synth, and a 4-track in a little house in Dunleary. And it was just exciting, it was an exciting time.
Oh no, it's beyond exciting.
Yeah.
So, and just a bit of context on Steve, so he was able to build a drum machine, but he also built his first guitar.
Oh, he did.
Out of a block of wood. And I think when he had finished it, like it was a magazine, an electronics magazine, because his dad was electronic, was handy in that way as well. And I think when he had built the guitar, he realized that you couldn't actually lift it because the wood was so heavy, but he'd done a great job. So I love that you've made the link, and I hadn't thought of that before, between the DIY of punk, which was anyone can play a guitar and make a racket and shout, and some of them weren't great players, kind of pretended that they weren't, but suddenly the availability of electronic equipment for people who were tuned into that.
It was the beginning of home recording, I would say, other than maybe before that you might have had a 2-track tape recorder or a cassette machine in a rehearsal room. But this was the first chance that people had of multi-track recording at home.
And you're at the forefront of that. You're one of the first 4-tracks that exists in Ireland, and
I think it was before the little, what came out was the Tascam Porta Studio that a lot of people bought in the early 80s. So it was about a year or two before the Porta Studio.
Yeah, and there's 2 lads in Dunleary with this. It's like building a rocket ship. And like, did you know how to use it? Because they didn't come with manuals, the technical manuals, but not how to make music with it. Like, how did you figure it out?
I actually don't know. It was just, I think it was, you'd hear something. I think it was probably from listening to other experimental music. Bands like Can, who experimented, and some early electronic sort of indie stuff from the UK. And I remember getting a few of those early compilation albums. Bands like the Dirty Column. And early experimental, Andy Partridge from XTC was doing a lot of stuff on the side with kind of backward sounds, and I think it was just that the interest in experimental music and
that comes across
the DIY thing.
Yeah, that comes across really well in your body of work, which stands the test of time. Like, your records still sound really good.
Most of it.
Most of it. No, the vast majority of it does. You were I don't know that at the start you were trying to write 3-minute pop songs. Were you playing with what the technology could do and kind of seeing where it led?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there is a, it's the whole thing about in hindsight, you'd look back, and in some ways I wish we'd stuck a little closer, but as the years go on and we started gigging, our first way of gigging then, the only way we could do it was by making backing tapes. So we used to put drums and bass, or try program our drum box and bass lines and stuff on a reel-to-reel, and we'd gig as a two-piece, playing over. So that was a way of doing it live, and that built up a something in Dublin. We got, and then we actually got our name. We were just Pat and Steve, up to about 82 or 3, and then our manager, actually Kieran Owens, who you interviewed, picked the name. And so, because we would have been Pat and Steve forever.
Yeah, and
from Dunleary.
Yeah, Pat and Steve from Dunleary. Like, you're going to write that on the back of your denim jacket. Now, yeah, so you'd such a bad band name, because it wasn't just Pat and Steve from Dunleary. It was, Steve Belton and Pat O'Donnell. So it sounded like two lads from Kerry.
Most people got it wrong. I'm still called Steve.
Amazing. So you're doing this ultra modern music, and there isn't really a synth rock scene when you start in Dublin. Now, more bands did come on board, but you were very much pioneers. You're innovators. You get Kieran Owens on board, who was the manager of the Virgin Prunes, which wouldn't have been the easiest job.
We did one thing together. He got us together once. They had a warehouse opposite the Project Arts, and we brought our 4-track in, and we did a little bit of recording with them. And I think one of the songs, we just didn't have enough tracks. They had so many layers they wanted, but it was an experience, and it was a good one too. And they were one of the other bands that would have been very experimental, maybe in a different way, in a more art focused way. But yeah, they were down. And there was a guy called Stano, if anyone remembers Stano. I remember in the project, so we were fans of his too.
I wrote the sleeve notes for Stano's album, just for the nerds out there. No, and that to me is really important. The first time I saw your name, to be honest, was on a Virgin Prunes record on the New Form of Beauty, and it was
one of those.
How's there a guy from Dunleary in with those weirdos from the north side? Because I went to every Prunes gig, and I never knew what was going to happen.
Were you at the Douglas Hyde one in about 1983, where they had the art exhibition?
Okay.
Do you remember that one?
Yeah. Not only was I there, but
that was a spectacular gig. Yeah.
It was obnoxious on every level. But here's a funny story. Because the Virgin Prunes realised that they hadn't met their target audience in Ireland, because half the people who went to see the Prunes wanted to kick the shit out of them. So it was all the lads from the squat up in Leeson Street who hated them, but they paid their $3.50 in the hope that they could beat them up during the gig or after. It made no difference. So it was very, very heavy. We were talking about this a little bit earlier about the Dublin scene was really, really heavy. Like when you went to a gig, there was a good chance that something bad would happen to you. And the Prunes were very confrontational, but they were also incredible. But
the Advance record, do you mean the Advance? Remember the Advance records at the top of...
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Advance Records up at the Stephen's Green was kind of the epicenter where the punks would meet.
And skinheads.
Punks, skinheads, mods, anyone who wanted, with a death wish, you'd go there to buy your Dorothy column records. But the Virgin Prunes, they did 2 shows in the Douglas Hyde, that one, and they did an exhibition. But they thought, we need to do an all ages show for the kids. Because the kids, they don't get a chance to see, blokes in dresses waving a pig's head, because Gavin worked in an abattoir. And for any of you who don't work in an abattoir, there's a really, really good fringe benefit in that you can take the pig's heads home, because no one was using them. Like, it was before that the new cuisine where you use all of the animal. So they were doing the all ages show in the afternoon, and I bought the only ticket for it. So they cancelled it, and the Compsat Angels were playing the same day in McGonagall's. So I thought I have to see the Prunes because I can't miss a Prunes gig. But you remember those bands? So you remember the Prunes? Stano, like Stano was outrageous in what he
He
did.
used to use film. He was one of the first guys
Yeah.
I saw using film on stage in the project around that time. There was another guy we were working with, mind you, there was another, which Kieran also introduced us, was a guy called Nigel Roth. And we did we did most of his, he wanted to start getting into mixed media and sort of, I remember he was very influenced by Laurie Anderson, and she was doing stuff, mixing, performance with music and film and stuff. So he got us to do his first couple, and that was very enjoyable collaboration. It was just really exciting. But yeah, he's an interesting guy.
Yeah, and that was, as a fan, Pirate Radio and John Peel now were more important to me than, no offense, Fab Vinny or Larry Gogan. So I was always looking for something that was just a little bit outside my comfort zone.
Yeah.
And your name kept cropping up with those bands, or sometimes on bills, and as I mentioned, working with the Prunes. Who else impressed you? Who do you remember from that era? Either Irish bands or bands like the Durruti column?
Well, yeah, I think it was I think around the time it started to get exciting. There was maybe a thing with punk at first where, after listening to Pink Floyd for a few years, it took me a while to, what's going on. It was when I started hearing bands like The Cure or XTC, and I just started hearing all those great, Joy Division, New Order, and then I guess for us there was a little bit of a similarity, and we weren't purely electronic. We were mixing guitars, but with synths, and it was when it went into that direction, I think it started getting exciting, and that's something I could do, or but and also circumstantial. I suppose whatever age I was at, you finish school, and the idea of making a living at music, didn't seem. So it was around that time, I think, maybe I can do this. Maybe there is a chance of, maybe I don't have to get a real job, and maybe there's a chance of I can make a living playing music. And I guess from there on is where it led to us gigging, and then from there, with all those influences, and then I guess what happened then into the 80s was, whether we realized it or not, our stuff was probably getting a little bit more commercial. And we did get a record deal in 1985, but going back to your earlier question, in hindsight, in a way, I prefer some of our earlier, the more experimental nature to what we did when we're, in saying that, they were happy days and they were great times. And I like all the Fountainhead catalogue, and it's easy to say in hindsight, but I always admire bands like New Order that I think really stuck to their, they didn't, they stuck to their guns artistically, and I don't think we were really strongly influenced by the record company, but a bit of it comes into play, that you're like, they picked the producer for our first album.
Okay.
So the sound of it, we were excited then, but maybe it was a little more commercial than I would have liked, but
Yeah,
you become part of it,
But to me, I can hear that tension on your records. That tension between people who just thought, we're just going to do something really weird and interesting and fun and innovative, and then the more structured side. Like I think they both exist in the before you signed to China Records. But the other amazing thing about this band is that you opened for some of the most important bands that visited Ireland at the time, and you competed with them. Like, it didn't feel like, there's the Irish lads, when's the real band coming on? So, Kieran was well liked. He was a great networker. It was the time when Dennis Desmond was beginning to bring more bands, and they were finding an audience. You played on that incredible. Now I wasn't at it, but it was probably one of the greatest gigs that ever took place in this country, and it was the U2, Big Country, Simple Minds,
Felix Bach.
Eurythmics, the band from Northern Ireland who came down.
Steel Pulse were on it, I think.
Steel Pulse were on it, and A Perfect Crime,
Yeah.
and then you opened it, and because it was Dublin, a huge crowd in Phoenix Park, and it was a helicopter filming it. So what do you, well, your parents, not you, that you decided, hey, wouldn't it be really, really cool if we tried to pull the helicopter out of the sky into the audience? And then the other thing that your parents did, Eve, it's funny being saying this to my students, you know, I tell them how bad their parents were, but now one of their parents is here, so I have to be careful what I say. And Annie Lennox broke down at the gig because there was a bunch of people shouting, "Go back to England, you bitch!" And she broke, you know, and she broke down in tears and said, "I'm from Scotland." So anytime there was a great gig in Ireland, you would just kick off. You know, you try and wreck something. But who else did you open for, and who impressed you live?
Actually, that up to the point of getting the record deal, yeah, those early 80s, we got a lot of supports. And actually MCD, they were only a smaller company, but I actually think some of it was practical. There was only two of us, and a tape recorder. So the engineers in the bands we were supporting loved us. No drum kit, no bass amp, you know, just we had a very streamlined. So, but the ones I remember were Depeche Mode and the SFX. I think we did that. We supported them in Belfast. A few people, Nick Kershaw. Yeah, so, but you know what? They were the nicest guys, and it was fun. Who else was over around that time? Stadium. Oh, and then of course Queen at Slane.
Yeah.
We opened up for it was Fountainhead, the Bangles.
The Bangles were on that. Yeah.
Chris Rea.
Yeah.
And Queen.
So how was that?
And
yeah.
That was
Because we're in Dunleary, how was it opening for Queen? I just asked you that.
Well, I was more interested in the Bangles personally.
Yeah.
Yeah. And especially the lead singer at the time. But anyway, they we didn't meet Freddie.
No.
They came in on a helicopter. I remember it was a grey, rainy day,
Right.
and funny enough, it didn't go down as one of the most famous or talked about slang gigs ever, like Springsteen or Dylan or something.
Yeah.
But yes, we got good press from it, and it was an experience. It was kind of terrifying. I remember, and it seemed to go. Was the fastest, half an hour of my life. It was kind of. But it was great. It did us good, and it was very, very. That was '86. So our first album was out,
Right.
and that was a good year. Yeah, we were very excited about the whole thing.
And am I correct in saying by then you were a band?
We were
It
a
wasn't
band.
just the two. So how did you go from being a two-piece where there was a real kind of a sonic integrity about you?
Yeah, when we signed to China, I guess we they signed The Art of Noise around the same time, and I guess we saw ourselves as a little bit one of those 80s, slightly electronic, using technology and stuff. But when we got the record deal, we had some money. It was the first time we had a little bit of, not lots. Some people used to think getting a record deal that your life was sorted. But anyway, we had some, so we put a band together at the time, and it wasn't a pool of session musicians. It was a smaller thing, so we had to look. I remember there was a kind of a touring band called Kathmandu from the north, and they were always kind of the most super duper. They used to do cover versions of Roxy Music and Bowie and make them sound better than the originals. They were just that. So we got in touch with Peter and Trevor.
Okay.
Trevor later ended up with the Water Boys, and then when I got into my production area, Peter ended up being the drummer, and the four of us which is a band that I produced and wrote with later on. And so it's a small country. But anyway, yeah, so we looked from the pool of people around. Probably not big enough to be going to London, and we used, and then our bass player was actually an old friend from Dunleary again, Willie DeMange, who teaches music and is a fine player. And other people, Philip Brennox was our keyboard player, and his brother, I think, does film big, very...
Stephen Reynolds,
yeah,
just incredible soundtracks.
Yeah. So again, so it's just who was available and close by, and as I said, there were different times too as well. No internet, like there were different times. You'd spend a lot of time on the phone, Kieran was great. Kieran always made stuff happen, and we had a good team.
Yeah. Obviously, everyone knows U2 stayed at home. Before that, all the bands had to emigrate. If you wanted a career as a musician, you had to leave this poor country. And Trevor being in Amsterdam is really interesting. But you were one of the first bands, along with U2, that were able to stay at home. Did that influence the way you thought about music? Would you have been a different band if you'd got the record deal and moved to Hounslow? Like, was there?
There was some, I know what you mean, Hounslow, but would we have been, there is something magic about London and always has been. It is such a, I think it's hard to answer. I've seen some people that had to go to London to make it up. I know Irish bands. I remember Micro Disney went there, great, and yeah, so would we have, it might have done us good in some ways to get, but I suppose we were one of the fortunate ones to get a record deal around that time. There were a few other Dublin bands. There was Cactus and Cactus World News and Into and Nua, and I'm just trying to think of the other bands that got that. And I think it might have been on the back of the U2 success. There were a lot of, and there were different times. There was more money. I guess there were A&R people at gigs and.
Yeah, but you were slightly ahead of those bands. As I remember, you were making music, doing gigs before they played. Couple of things. We're in a record shop. So where were you buying your records back in the day?
Where was I buying my records? I'm just trying to think. Pat Egan's Sound Cellar is my earliest memory.
Amazing.
But then probably Murray's on Grafton Street. Actually, and another guy I worked with later used to work there, who was in a band called the Hellfire Club, a small Tom Doyle.
Yeah.
He was like the most handsome guy in Dublin, and he worked in there, and I remember they had all those early, like the first Cure singles stuck to the wall in coloured vinyl, and Gang of Four, and early Rough Trade, and I think Maurice was a good spot there, I guess. Those two places, Holidays to London, Scarring, the record shops.
Okay, now that's really important. So, was that before you started the band?
All during that period. I lived in Dunleary, we had the boat. Yeah. I'd go to London regularly to buy some records or a leather jacket or something.
Yeah. And would you go to gigs, or was it just buying records?
I was a bit younger than when I started, and not so much gigs.
Yeah.
I did see, I saw a few great gigs in London various times around then, but not regularly. But no, it was always a bit of a draw, London. It was very exciting coming from Ireland.
Yeah, and it's important to calculate that, but so many Irish people, because records were really expensive in this country, because we had VAT on them. So anyone who has a record collection that lived here, and someone in England who has the same record collection, the person in England didn't pay probably 75% of what we had to. So the amount of records bought in Ireland, by Irish people in England and then brought over on the B&I, must really have perverted the British chart.
Just come to be Camden Town, wasn't there like a
for
road,
bootleg
for
tapes,
reggae and punk and different.
Okay,
a real markety kind of.
Yeah, so you opened for really, really big acts. You got the major record deal, and you've mentioned that there were other attractive men in your band. Was Jim Core
Oh, Jim.
in your
Okay,
band
so
before
we're-
he thought, well, maybe my sisters would sell more records than these people from Dunleary?
So we're up to album 2. So first album,
Yeah.
then that one, 85, 86, Slane. We toured America then.
Yeah.
As kind of a college tour. That thing, the early days of college radio. Did, again, amazing, first time on the bus, 5 Irish lads, and a lot of small gigs, some supports to bigger acts, and kind of clubs, college radio, all that kind of thing. And so that was the kind of end and the highlight of that. Then it was into album 2. We made album 2 then in Bath in England. It was The Voice of Reason, and again, that was probably influenced by the touring in America. So I think somewhere in my head, we have to make the album more American sounding. So it's probably not one of my, well, it's fine, it's still, but maybe that had some influence on the sound. Yeah, so we made that record, and when it came to tour that record, we were getting a band together, and we came across Jim Core, and I forget exactly how, but I remember his parents coming to with the 3 sisters and Jim, because the girls were young. We're talking 87, and all the band had to behave themselves. Needless to say, Jim, introduce me to your sisters. And the mother, actually, you can see the mother was the nicest. His parents, the mother was just the most lovely lady, and pretty. Where they all got, you can see where it came from. So, but anyway, yes. So we came across Jim, and Jim. He was a different guy. He was quiet. He was so quiet, and just I remember me and Steve. We'd often have to share a room when we're on tour. And the hotel, the door would bang. It's like 2 a.m. We just had our beers and we're in bed. And Jim say, "Hey, what's going on? What's going on?" He said, "Everyone's gone to bed, Jim." And it's over. The party's over. But he was quite the first thing I noticed about him, they were so musical. They were a really musical bunch. It was just in them. I remember Jim, the first time I heard him just tinkling on a piano, and he was just such a lovely touch on the piano. So, and then the chords, of course, became a big, super successful pop band, and
They became the fountainhead that we exported.
Actually, I did catch him once. I remember looking over my shoulder, and he was. I said, stop that! Yeah, no clapping on stage.
So he was ready. He was ready. He was waiting for his next band. Fantastic. Again, when you look at the histories that have been written about the Irish music industry, I do think that Auto da Fe and the Fountainhead, aren't as prominent as they should be. You're almost too early for what then became, I think, the post U2 history. It was as if nothing had happened before then. So, as a fan of both of your bands, it was such a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Neil, for this is such a beautiful room. So thank you very much.
It's lovely. It's really, it's a lovely room. It's my first time here, so it's really nice. I'd imagine a few small gigs down here might be in order.
Great. They've begun. So thank you very much to Pat O'Donnell.